Hello, everybody. Welcome. Glad we have some time together to explore and remember and learn and grow together in a beautiful way. What a great luxury it is to have this time when we can explore the aspects of our origin and being, our humanity, our animal nature, our awareness, our minds, that our societies mostly inhibit or counterfeit. It's such a strange predicament we're in as human beings. It's always been, at least for many thousands of years, it's always been a strange predicament. And the peculiar strangeness of each person's predicament is unique to them, but also to their time, the time in which they were born and live, and to the places in which they pursue their lives. Of course, that's kind of strange language. Only part of our life is pursuit. There are many other facets that are almost the opposite of pursuit if we look carefully at them. Part of the problem with talking in this way is just that in English, and I'm sure it's true in other languages, though not in the same way, there's all these metaphors. One of the most prominent of the metaphors is the container metaphor, right? I have a mind, as if my body's a container and there's a mind inside, right? Or a mind is a possession. But this is the language of the superficial aspects of our nature. And over time, they don't seem so superficial to us. They come to seem central. The aspects of thinking and language, tropes, metaphors, analogies, ideas, concepts, all these things. But today I want to talk a little bit about the difference, or the distinction really, between what I sometimes refer to as our interiority, which again supposes an inside and an outside, and the world as we often experience and think about it or speak about it. Last night I was having a conversation with my dear friend William, and we explored some of these ideas together. It was really beautiful. I'm really grateful to have William as my friend and to be able to have deep conversations with him fairly regularly. And one of the things we were talking about is something I'm going to pose as the distinction between the costume of our humanity and the one who's wearing it. And strangely, that one has a very peculiar way of being. Because it's not really a one. And it's not precisely a zero either. It's something almost impossible to point at meaningfully in language because its dimensionality is different from anything that fits in language. Or at least this is one way of thinking about why it's difficult. So what do I mean by our costume? Well, at the physical level, from the physical perspective, our costume could be understood as our body. Though I can't be sure, I strongly suspect that our nature is not our body, but rather our nature is somehow enmeshed with our body or tangled up with it. Just taking a moment to greet one of my friends here. And everyone can understand that the clothing we wear is something of a costume. And every once in a while we have celebrations where we wear actual costumes, or we might be in a film or in a play or some kind of presentation where we dress up as someone who we ordinarily aren't. Most of our vocations have costumes associated with them. And part of what I mean by our costume is our presentation behavior, right? And not just to others, but also to ourselves. How we present in our own consciousness, in awareness, in the world, in the strange social mess that the remains of what might have been societies, right? That we're all variously and somewhat uniquely involved with. I apologize if there's a little wind noise today, but we'll continue nonetheless. So, jobs have costumes. Nurses, doctors, lawyers, politicians, police, fire people, soldiers, teachers. We all have, in these roles, there are costumes associated with them. And part of that has to do with the strangely hierarchical imperatives of the social world. And even though our position in modernity in the West or in the East is unique, there's always been some kind of costume stuff going on. Indigenous peoples may have special paints, clothing, objects that they wear for different kinds of situations, ceremonial or hunting, or just regular day-to-day life. And even those indigenous peoples who are often naked, there are aspects of changing their appearance that are associated with life phases, hierarchy in the social context, ceremony, and other features of their unique way of being in the world. So the surface level of costume is familiar to us. What we wear, how we see ourselves, how we might imagine ourselves if we were role-playing. In the classic role-playing games, there are classes often, and these are classes like cleric, fighter, ranger, wizard, druid, thief. And each of the classes has peculiar ways of appearing in our games. But what I'm actually thinking about when I talk about this idea, our costume and the one who's wearing it, is something deeper. Many of us are trained over time, we're imprinted and we develop in human culture, in our families, with our peers, with the cohorts that we both belong to and that we reject, both. And we have something, or at least we don't have something. It's really something we're doing, right? It's a behavior. We behave in the image of something that's often referred to as ego. And I want to be modestly clear about what I mean by ego. Ego is our self-story, our self-idea, and the ways that we relate with ourselves and the world as the costume. I am separate, I am Darren, I have this history, I have these fears, these vulnerabilities, these strengths, these weaknesses, these injuries or these illnesses, these friends, this job, all of these things. This way of speaking, my vocal music, my appearance, my home, my car, my wardrobe, all these things, all the things, yeah? And we come to identify with the costuming. That's part of our human development, and we wouldn't necessarily want to get rid of it entirely, but it's profoundly useful to be able to see through it. Or even, and this is the thing I'm really hoping to get at, to be able to take off the costume, even for a moment. Because if we could take off the costume just for a moment, we would discover, or rather, yes, it would be uncovered to us, something about our true nature, our original light, our soul, our essence. And for most of us, this is thoroughly buried in costumes and stories, identification, confusion, right? The fundamental confusion of believing and knowing that I am my costume, right? I am my story, I am my appearance, I am how my body looks or doesn't look, I am what I've done or not done, I. And it's not an accident that we use the same sound to indicate the organ with which we see and the self-idea. And this is really important because once we're entranced with our self-idea, and that happens over time in childhood, it doesn't really start out that way. Yeah? It doesn't begin that way. We don't have so much of a self-idea when we're very small. Maybe not much at all. It's something that develops throughout our childhood and in an ongoing way throughout our lives. But the strange thing is, we come to see that, or rather with and through the filter of our costume. And this is a form of seeing, but at the same time, it's a kind of blindness. And the blindness builds up over time. Yeah. So that eventually, we're in a very strange situation where we're seeing not with our essence or spirit or soul or emotional self or with our somatic self. There's different ways of talking about these things. A lot of them are actually just more costuming, especially once we begin talking. But we become confused between the prosthetics of identity and the being that's undergoing a kind of stifling, ever more confusing blindness in our ordinary consciousness and awareness. Because we come to identify with the superficial layers that have been established over time, the idea of myself, the stories, the narratives, all these things. And perhaps it's natural for us to have stories and things, but it's certainly very painful when our fundamental nature is profoundly occluded and ever more profoundly occluded throughout our lives by the costume. And in a way, we could think of the costume as habits of structured forgetting. Forgetting what? Well, forgetting that we're not separate. Forgetting that we're not alone and really can't be alone. Though we can certainly be lonely and isolated in some of the layers of our human experience. And that's painful. Because fundamentally, we are incredibly delicate and profoundly sensitive beings, and animals, humans. And all of that sensitivity and vulnerability gets overridden as the costume gathers layer upon layer over time in situations, and we forget our original nature, so that in our waking world it may have only very modest influence, because we play the role of ourselves. And it's a role we partly inherited and partly developed. But underneath the costume is a being of infinite beauty, sensitivity, vulnerability. And by vulnerability, I don't mean it can be harmed. I mean it feels. It's emotional. It's energy in motion and transformation, like the rushing water of the rapids of a river, and like the still, silent pool beneath a tree that the river's carved out in a rock over thousands of years. And one of the things, strangely, that the costume interferes with is memory. Not the ordinary kind of memory, a different kind. The memories of the before of our lives, right, as human beings. The memories, perhaps, of previous existences that may not be explicitly our own, because again, there is no real explicit self or identity. But the memories of before, when we were with and for all beings in communion always. And the memories of previous existences that are, rather than being the possessions of a distinct self, they are the origins and the constellated relationships that our seeming distinction is born out of when we arrive in birth as a being, an animal, a plant, an insect, a human, or maybe a cohort of beings, the world herself, the solar system, ecologies, the mountains, the rivers, the lakes, the meadows, the deserts, the frozen places. Because before we take on the costume, our extent is unlimited. And it's a very strange and profound kind of unlimitedness, because it's often, anyway, it's uniquely intimate. With something very hard to describe. Sometimes I refer to it as the my arc. All of the beings and situations in and beyond time-space. That's our original body. Or rather, that's one of the phases of becoming embodied. Because our original body is probably so unusual and profound that there's no way to describe what it is, what it's doing, its extent, its histories, because it doesn't really have those qualities. One might think of it as pure undifferentiated potential. The potential to acquire form, relation, distinctions, characteristics, and so on. Or to wear those as part of the costume. Underneath our costume, we are not the person we imagine ourselves to be. And the stories and histories, ideas, concepts, and words are trivial contrivances that, were we to be able to taste deeply our true nature, we would not be very concerned about, and in fact might be perfectly willing to let go of, right? Throw them away. Strangely, apparently the costumes are supposed to protect something, but instead of protecting it, they replace it, and that is a tragic agony. Because now we will live in and through the costume, seeing with the costume, forgetting in the ways the costume blinds us and entices us into the forgettings of. It's a very painful situation, and it's an isolating situation. Because for a being like ourselves, whose true family is all beings in all of time, and whose true nature is beyond all beings in all of time, to think ourselves trapped in a single body is a peculiar form of painful isolation. This word's a little bit strange, isn't it? I so late. I'm so late. I've become inhibited temporally so that I'm always arriving late. I am the late ion. Yeah, I am an iso-late ion. I don't want to make too much of the language, and yet there's something useful there, something fascinating to pay attention to, as long as we're careful and don't get carried away. And by carried away, I mean fascinated by endless little fragments of language and numerism and things like this, to the degree where the energy of our consciousness is profoundly compromised, so that it can become trapped in myriads of strange little correlations and seeming coincidences and such. Some of our traditions are aware that there's a costume. What we call psychology is a way of helping people to disentangle some of the aspects of their costuming that are or have become more or less pathological. Of course, what pathological means is open to interpretation. And psychology is a bit strange in that rather than delivering us from the costume, it wants us to form a costume that'll work better in our societies so that we won't suffer as much. Meditation traditions, some of them, and in all of these paths we have the problem of the path has been captured by the culture in some way. And that's a funny word too, cult you are, right? We become, in a way over time, a local cult, right? We're the cult of our own identity. And we're deeply committed to this cult. We believe it almost absolutely. We may harm ourselves or others or the world under the sway of this strange hypnotic idea that we're a separate self, deserving of certain possessions and rights and so on. And this is all social layer costuming. In a way, some portions of the movements that we collect under the moniker of political correctness have to do with this. They have to do with the assertion of a specific kind of costume and the further assertion that we should be free to wear whatever costumes we like and that other people should respect the costumes that we've identified with. And this isn't entirely wrong or bad, but it easily can be captured by processes we're unaware of and become toxic. And there's different ways it can become toxic. One of them is the way of insisting upon a particular identity for ourselves and insisting that other people recognize and, value and respect this identity. Again, not an entirely bad idea, but an idea and a path that's filled with traps that are invisible as long as we're busy insisting on something. And part of our costume tells us or inclines us to see situations or people or other beings as other, as bad, as undesirable, as wrong, as confused, as dangerous, as predatory. Now, of course, there are lots of others, but otherizing beings and people is a painful and dangerous process, and often it has a pathological root. Right? Now, it's natural for humans to have, this is a complex conversation here, but I'll say something brief about this. All throughout history, as far as we know, from what we've been able to recover or remember, the in-group and out-group dynamic is very profound. Humans have been extremely territorial and inclined to include certain beings and places and situations and people as us, and other beings and situations and places and people as them. And that's a topic worth an entire recording. But one of the things that's bizarre about our current situation is that there's the agenda of a kind of often false communalization. We shouldn't see others as bad or wrong or different in a way that we don't like. Everyone should see everyone as beautiful and human and all of this. And you can see that there's something true in that, because that's like the old memory, right? That's like the before of the costume. When all beings were potentially our friends, and there were no real beings who were other or them, at least not in our experience. Our parents saw other beings as other and them, but when we were very little, there was a natural sort of communion experience where I'm not even a separate self. We are a we together, and the we is what I am. Again, it's very difficult to speak meaningfully about the being wearing these costumes. And even calling it a being might be confused, because that implies it's distinct. Yet as human beings, our distinction is certainly, well, it's complicated. It's real enough that we will all admit, and protect our body and understand it as separate, unless we're sharing it together on purpose. So what is lost when we put on the costume, and we lose it more and more over time, what is sacrificed, is the incredible sensitivities, senses, faculties, memories, gifts, even siddhis, powers that are natural to the being who wears the costume. And it would be a bit like a bird that was born to fly in 12 different kinds of atmosphere, having its wings taped to it and bound to it, so that now it can't fly in any atmosphere, but it can pretend to fly in human culture. And some of us actually learn to fly in human culture. We become culturally triumphant. And strangely, though this is nourishing and fulfilling for some of us, it can also be incredibly miserable. We imagine that to be rich or famous is to be happy. It's very clearly not the case. Many of the most famous people, many of the richest people, were not merely miserable, they were so miserable that they took their lives, sometimes when they were very young. The fame and notoriety was insufficient to nourish the being wearing the costumes that became famous, wealthy, notable. And this situation has never been as weird as it is in our time. It's very, very strange and estranging. Because the being that's wearing the costume knows that the costume largely opposes its existence. It largely opposes its recognition, its growth, its development, its nature, its faculties, its sensitivities, its needs. And perhaps at the core of our essence there are no needs. But there are layers, and as we move away from the core, needs arise. I strongly suspect that when we're dreaming, the being who's usually having to wear a costume, some of its wings have become free. And now it can fly a little bit and remember its natures and faculties and origins. And this is part of why in dreaming, what we would ordinarily think of in our waking life as identity is a very peculiar thing indeed. And the waking mind reduces the dreaming experience to familiar identities when we awaken and think of the dream or remember it. But the dreaming mind, this is not a good representation of the experience of the dreaming mind. Right? This is the waking mind's sort of cut and paste version. Right? Paste this identity here, cut that identity there. Now, since it's very difficult to point toward our actual nature, the one who's wearing all the costumes and subject to these costumes and suffering from them, in my talk today, I'll mostly speak about the costuming and the problems that arise therefrom. But the aspect of us that is our original nature, our essence, our soul, and again, that idea of a soul is a very strange thing. It's not like what we imagine. It might be something like the unique, local character of our embodiment of all beings in all of time, in all relations. And more, much more. The embodiment of processes and situations we have no language for and will not fit in language. But one of the things I really wanted to talk about, I'm going to switch topics a little bit here, is how incredibly vulnerable we are. Because we are sensitive in ways so profound that if we were aware of them for a moment, we would give up on technology altogether. Because all of the things that we instance as technologies are the skeletal remains of abilities that we have 1,000-fold more of, 1,000,000-fold more of, an infinifold more of. We have old stories of magic and spiritual embodiment. And these stories are fragments of the faculties and sensitivities natural to our nature. And these are what the costume largely replaces. With tokens and prostheses and costuming and clothing, hierarchy and identity and stories. Some of the meditation traditions, as I was saying earlier, are aware of this. And some of them are more cult-like than others, though most of them have some, at least modestly cult-like aspects. But many of the meditation traditions start out with the awareness of this problem, right? And often when people are first approaching the tradition, and this happened to me, the teacher will try to dissuade them, right, and say, look, what brought you here was the intention to add something to your costume. But the place that you've arrived at here, a meditation hall or the teacher's home or wherever we're at, the teacher is very aware of the strange problem that the aspirant is thinking, oh, I'll get a new costume, right? I'll be a monk or a nun or a Zen student or a yogi, right? When what's actually going to happen if we pursue meditation deeply and have some degree of affinity for it is that we're going to wreck the costume. We're going to destroy the costume. We're going to make a big rip in the costume so that we get a glimpse of the one who's wearing it. That one who is neither one nor all ones. That one who is neither separate nor distinct, neither a boy or a girl, neither an adult or a child, neither an expert or a fool. In fact, what we may discover is that the one who is wearing the costume isn't there. At least not in the sense of being distinct from anything. And so often when people begin the path of meditation, the teacher may how shall I put this? The teacher will push back, right, and say, that door you just came in, just turn around and walk right out of it. Because right now you're confused. You're thinking you're going to get something when what you're going to get is ungetting. And you're probably not ready for desiring ungetting yet. And the teacher's also aware that simply by living our ordinary life path, costume and all, the being wearing the costume, the one wearing the costume, develops, in a sense. And all of this is so complex. Well, it's at once infinitely complex and unimaginably simple. Literally unimaginably simple. The imagination is not good with incredibly simple things, especially once it's wearing the costume. It overlooks incredibly simple things because the nature of the costume is to make use of sophisticated things. Arguments and narratives and concepts, ideas, theories, all these things. More costuming. But what I wanted to say was, the other day as I was walking around, I had a moment of incredible heartfulness. And I looked at all the people around me and I felt their astonishing vulnerability. Our bodies are vulnerable. Our emotions are vulnerable. We are delicate physically. We can be destroyed completely. In our hearts, our bodies can be destroyed. We're frangible, we can die, we can be broken, injured, isolated, we can be enmeshed in circumstances we have no way to control or repair. We're all like little children. We're all deeply vulnerable and delicate in our humanity. And when I felt this, my heart just opened up. And I remember I was looking at a young man, just taking a moment to try to breathe and be and just exist for a moment in the thronging noise of machines all around him. And he was wearing on his back a huge pack that was clearly designed to carry food, and he was at work bringing food to people on his motorcycle. And he wasn't a particularly attractive man, and I could feel that he had a very hard life. And I loved him. I just felt like I wanted to go up to him and say, I see you. I see the trouble and the pain and the isolation and the struggle and the confusion, the work, the desperation. I see that you're starving inside. I see that you're hurting. I see that you've been profoundly alone. And I love you, and I believe in you, and I think you're beautiful. You are a beautiful being. Now, I might have actually walked up and said those things. My soul said those things without language. And I saw all of the people around me and just, I felt so incredibly humble at their courage. At the difficulty of being human, particularly in our time, though it's always been differently difficult. The problem now, however, is just millions of objects and machines and strange, non-human collectives of humans doing really bizarre, dangerous, pathological things all day, every day, without cessation, all times, most places. One of the greatest ironies, I remember when, not that I don't watch television anymore ever, but, well, very, very rarely I might. But I remember when it began to become popular to advertise automobiles as a way to get out of the city and, quote, back to nature, unquote. And something in me completely recoiled from this travesty, the sickening irony of an idea like that. And you know, part of the reason that our costumes are so thick and developed and pathological is because the societal and commercial contexts, the ideological contexts that we're enmeshed with, most of us, are unsurvivably bizarre, mechanical, and toxic. And our sensitivities die away in response to being subjected to this nightmare. And so eventually we just become, many of us, a sort of thin shell, or maybe, you know, a very overwrought shell. And we can't feel our feelings anymore. We know the flower is beautiful intellectually, but we don't experience the beauty of the flower. And far less so in the age where we have the bizarre prostheses that we call smartphones. Because then we're inclined to take pictures of things that we think are beautiful instead of experiencing their beauty in our hearts. And millions of pictures don't amount to a single moment of the beauty that our heart is capable of encompassing and resonating with and ringing with and singing with and dancing for and with. And no amount of photographs or cars or money or boats or houses will ever return that to us. It's something we must pierce the costume and recapture together. And when we become aware of the whole costuming problem, the big mess that I've been orbiting here, then we have a chance at least to understand why we're in pain a lot. Why we feel broken, why we feel alone. Because the costume doesn't feel, but the one wearing it feels what the costume communicates to it, especially while we're awake. And in a way, that costume is a bit like a smartphone. It's a prosthesis. But it's a psycho-emotional prosthesis, perhaps a spiritual prosthesis. And it's natural that people who wear these prostheses around and identify with them would eventually develop technologies like cars and smartphones and computers, ways to not be here, right? That's what those are. They're ways to not be here. They're replacements for intimacies and relationships that we might otherwise be having together and enjoying together with and for each other, with and for the history and future of all beings. And that's really our nature. And part of the magic thing, part of the peculiar irony, is that even if we live our entire lives and don't take off our costumes, something's going to take the costume off for us, right? At least to some degree. And dreaming is one of those experiences, but illness, death, reverent love, devotion, all of these things are ways that our interiority can push through the costume and still find expression in our lives and hearts, in our days, in our time of life. And that's why the teacher is not too worried about telling the student, turn around, leave the way you came in. If you decide to stay here, you're going to find yourself in a trap. And the reason the teacher is saying this is because it's really very true. The costume has come looking for more costuming, and the teacher can sense this and knows that it's going to be a really disappointing process to understand that not only are you not going to get more costuming of the kind you like, it's going to be painful and you're going to suffer as you try to remove some of the layers of that costume that's so familiar that you think of as yourself. And if you just go back to your regular life, then you won't have to suffer that way. You'll suffer in other ways, but your soul will still be educated. And death will remove the costume. Perhaps not completely, but there's lots of ways the costume gets rubbed off by life. And this is one of the reasons why I think my old Zen teacher, my first teacher, John Tarrant Roshi, this is one of the reasons why he's a fan of deep practice in crisis and darkness. Is because that's when the costume is really getting rubbed off, right? It's getting ground away by pain, confusion, suffering, and loss. And in that situation, our true nature is closer to accessibility and awareness. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just take the costume off for a moment and see with our original seeing and be with our original being, free at last, in liberty and wonder, in reverence and awe, for those are qualities. And yes, I understand the irony of saying there's qualities, but those are qualities natural to the one who wears the costume, and only partially natural to the costume that's being worn. The tragedy of wearing the costume all the time is that it deprives us of forms of memory that are so astonishing that nothing in our waking experience muchly resembles them. Though there are strange exceptions. Right? And some of those exceptions happen in crisis and agony, and some of them happen in ecstasy and wonder. I too have a costume. The fact that I'm aware of it is helpful, and I work at removing it now and then. But it's a very difficult thing. In fact, it's ironic because working at removing the costume can become part of the costume, right? And this is why the teacher says, turn around, leave through the door you came in from. Of course, I didn't do that. I really wanted that. I really thought he was right. I was looking. My costume was looking for another piece of clothing to add to the collection. But now, some 30 or 40 years later, I've realized, well, I've at least come to understand the peculiar problems of the costume and the one who's wearing it, and what it interferes with, and how the culture celebrates and further demands its elaboration, and so on and so forth. There's a little sow bug walking across the cement. All of the creatures are absolutely vulnerable. They can be destroyed by a trivial disturbance of the environment. So can we. But we can also be destroyed in our hearts by the bizarre, conflicted imperatives of the necessity of costuming. So I'd like to take a moment and just have compassion and love for all of the human beings, including our costumes, and just the recognition of how vulnerable we are and how fundamentally our nature is in communion with each other and all beings, in all of time and place. All blessings to you and those you love, those who love you and those they love. All blessings on your life path. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon.